right, sounds good. So my name is Chloe Hacker, and my capstone project was developing a user-friendly tool for determining and mapping the difference normalized burn ratio. So I want to start by giving an introduction just about fires in general. Fire is an important land management tool. It's traditionally been used to manage large and small portions of land. And traditionally, wildfires were not immediately suppressed, but with the birth of the Forest Service, this was kind of a practice that was implemented in the early 1900s and continued through about 1960 until there was a policy change. And the act of suppression obviously doesn't allow fire to interact with the land and prepare it for years to come. So this has created some issues in our current day forests regarding to fuel loading, which is just an excess of fuel in the forests available and ready to burn in the event of a wildfire. So fire is an important tool, but also wildfires can pose a threat to humans' health, culture, and property. And since the 1980s, generally speaking, the extent of wildfires has increased, as you can see in this graphic here. And the more fires and acres that burn, the more it costs to fight them. So recently, yearly, the US has spent around $1 billion to pay for wildfire fighting and post-wildfire mitigation efforts. And this number hit $2.3 billion in 2020, probably with some other influences from COVID, but nonetheless, it is a large amount of money, and therefore this having tools to help assess damage could be helpful. So this is an example on the left. It's an image of a burn scar from the museum fire that burned in northern Arizona. And then on the right is subsequent flooding that occurred after summer rain events. This fire was relatively small at 1,900 acres, but because of its positioning so close to the town of Flagstaff, when big summer monsoons hit, it caused big damage through flooding because the scarred land, did not have the capability to deal with water when it normally, or as it normally can with vegetation. So this project was motivated by the desire or interest in figuring out how to maybe develop a tool that's easily accessible and could be used by a wider variety of people in order to assess damage after a wildfire burned through a landscape. Because in some cases, it's not super pertinent to do post-fire rehabilitation efforts, but in some cases it is when things such as homes or cultural resources are at risk from this fire, as we can see in this one example. And then additionally, just this one small fire costs around $12 million for wildfire firefighting and post-fire flood efforts as well. So the general goals of the project were taking data from before and after the fire, Landsat imagery data, calculating the normalized burn ratio, and then calculating the difference normalized burn ratio to evaluate burn severity, mapping it, applying symbology so that it's easy to read and consistent, and then clipping this to the wildfire polygon so you can focus on that specific area, and then automating this process through a Python script when you edit it to call whatever data you are interested in analyzing. So the data that I used for this project primarily was just Landsat 8 or 9 data taken from the Earth Explorer website from US Geological Survey. And I just chose a selection of fires in the last couple of years and then used the search filters to focus in on obtaining data after the fire within 7 days so that the imagery was most accurate in portraying what the fire looked like or what the land looked like immediately after the fire went through it. And then additionally, I used this data set from the National Interagency Fire Center, which had polygons of wildfires from 2021 and forward to the current day, so that the rasters could be clipped to the appropriate polygon. So the methodology for this project, I started in ArcGIS Pro using the model builder tool to compute each of the values for the pre and post fire normalized burn ratio, then using those rasters to calculate the difference normalized burn ratio, so just the difference from before and after, mapping it and applying the symbology so that it was able to read it. And then I ended up manually clipping the rasters to the polygons so that you could view just the wildfire of interest. And then the code and then from there exported it to a Python window and edited it so that it could be used to call different data sets, added some notes. So if it were to be used by someone that was not me, it would be clear where you need to edit the code so that it is drawing data or like drawing the files from the proper environment on your computer in your files to whatever area you are looking to analyze. And that's just a snippet of that code. And then before I get into the results, I just want to briefly explain that so normalized burn ratio is an index that uses the difference in the way that healthy and unhealthy or burned vegetation reflect light, meaning if something is like burned or bare soil, that is reflected in the satellite imagery. And then the difference normalized burn ratio shows us the burn severity index, which uses what the area looked like before and after the wildfire to show how that wildfire impacted the area. And these calculations use near infrared and shortwave infrared wavelengths to determine the state and quality of the vegetation in that area. So this chart shows the different ranges for burn severity and what color is associated with what severity level. And then this is the symbology that I applied in the tool. So the darker greens show regrowth at a high or low rate. That bright green is unburned. And then from the yellows to purples, we go from low severity up to high severity. So you can, at a quick glance, kind of have those colors pop out and associate them to what severity level they are showing. So one fire that I analyzed for my results, this is the Pipeline Fire, smaller fire at 26,000 acres. And at first glance, you predominantly see green and yellow showing burned or unburned and low severity burn with some pockets of orange. And then to put it into context, when you're, looking at the fire, we can know that it burned through like communities. So taking into consideration those structures that were damaged and then focusing on higher severity burn areas and putting boots on the ground there to make a judgment of if restoration efforts need to be implemented given their proximity to homes. And then once you have run this tool, you can do some further calculations, like specifically breaking down percentages of how much burned at what severity level. And, you know, from there, take it to your own interest. But that was one example. And then another example was the Dixie Fire in California. So just to show a larger fire at 900,000 acres compared to the previous slide. This wildfire, you can see after running the tool that the burn severity is a lot more varied throughout the landscape. The burn mosaic, or the pattern in which this fire burned, was going from it hits the full range of enhanced regrowth to high severity. And so running this tool, you know, is helpful because it can inform people at a quick glance what the pattern of the burn was, and if one area was hit harder than another, or if there's a large chunk of land that kind of burned at one severity level, whether it was unburned or high severity, something that could be a watch out for future days, future events. Because if something was burned at high severity, it might need restoration efforts. And if it was completely unburned, it could pose an issue for future fires if there's excess fuels there. So this tool was applied to a number of fires discussed further in my paper, but all with the same process of downloading the data specific to the fire and then editing the tool so that it calls the appropriate data in order to produce the map. And a few challenges that I encountered throughout it were I wasn't able to automate the process of clipping it to the wildfire polygon, which would have just made it nicer. You can still use it and just overlay the polygon on top of the raster and view it that way. Obviously, it just doesn't look as nice, and it's a little bit easier or a little bit harder to read, but that was one main challenge that was encountered. And then some potential for future applications would be to, say, use this tool yearly and evaluate, you know, what a landscape looks like after the wildfire burns. And then this also could be applied for other catastrophic events or for other restoration efforts, like if there was a logging operation and then a reforestation, you can monitor the progress of that or use it, you know, after another big environmentally impactful event like a flood or something that can have the potential to greatly affect a landscape. So, yep, that concludes my presentation. So thank you all for listening. And those are my references.
Great job, Chloe. I'm going to stop